You are listening to From Embers, a weekly show on CFRC 101.9 FM about anarchist and anti-authoritarian ideas and practice. We are broadcasting from the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples on land that has come to be called Kingston, Ontario, Canada because of the thievery and brutality of the Canadian state and its empire-loving parents. From Embers is about fires, some real and some metaphorical. Fires started generations ago and tended to over the years. Little sparks all across this territory that we hope will grow, spread, and engulf the thieving state called Canada and the capitalist system that has plagued this land since the fur trade.
Today on From Embers, I'll be speaking with Jay from the Tilted Scales Collective about conspiracy, how those charges have been used against anarchists in the US and Canada, and how to grapple with some of the problems that this particular kind of repression brings up. It felt like an appropriate time to revisit this topic as the anniversary of the J20 protests against Trump's inauguration was earlier this week. Anyway, I'll keep it short. Let's get to the interview.
I'm an anarchist who lives in the so-called United States, and for the last decade or so, I've been involved in anti-repression efforts here in the US for people facing charges on a state and federal level, as well as more general legal support. I've also provided direct support for folks doing prison time, both like short and long term. And specifically, some of my experience has been around supporting individuals such as CC McDonald, as well as navigating collective defense strategies following summit protests, in particular J20 protests in 2017. I'm part of a group called the Tilted Scales Collective, and we're a small collective of anarchists who've been involved in anti-repression organizing over the years. In 2017, we released a book called The Tilted Guide to Being a Defendant, or Defendant's Guide to the Criminal Legal System, which aims to be a resource for folks involved in social struggle to navigate their criminal charges. We're working on a follow-up book, which will be published by AK Press, that is a guide for attorneys who are representing radical or anarchist clients.
Do you want to talk a bit about the Tilted Scales Collective and some of the work that you guys do?
The Tilted Scales Collective is a pretty small collective of anarchists who have been involved in anti-repression organizing, legal support type organizing for the past decade or more. Our group has not been around for that long, but we've been doing that kind of those sorts of efforts for a while. And all of us have experience organizing around like anarchists or radical folks who are facing charges, both like at the state and federal level, as well as like supporting folks who are incarcerated, whether that be like short or long term. Additionally, like some of us have experience doing like legal support infrastructure stuff for like mass mobilizations, like Republican National Convention or J20. And one thing that we do or have done in 2017, we published a book called The Defendants' Guide to the Criminal Legal System. And it's aimed to be like a resource for radical folks who are facing charges to help them like better sort out their personal, political, and legal goals, and like hopefully move through the criminal legal system with political integrity and like with maybe like less fear and a clear understanding of like how to get through that. And currently we're working on, so the Defendant's Guide was published a couple of years ago, and we toured around with it, and now we're working on a follow-up guide, and it's going to be published through AK Press, seems like in 2021. And that guide is a resource guide for attorneys who are representing radicals or anarchists or folks involved in social struggle. And it's much more like legal nitty-gritty about like various ways that repression against radicals and anarchists commonly occurs, as well as like different legal defenses that might be available. And it's cool to me because I think that there's a lot of like movement attorneys who are pretty involved in supporting anarchists and other folks involved in social struggle, at least here in the US. But there's also, like we saw with J20, a lot of attorneys who like have not a lot of familiarity with like collective defense, or even just like the concept that folks would like not want their attorney, like going to court, going to trial, and like saying a bunch of negative things about the co-defendants. So yeah, hopefully it's a useful resource.
Yeah, could you maybe say a bit about the kinds of information you were hoping to make available to attorneys, or some of the problems that you were hoping that guide would address?
Sure, yeah, definitely. Even many attorneys who are like maybe might be sympathetic to certain forms of activity that gets criminalized are like required by their job to like kind of by the nature of being an attorney to counsel their clients about their individual legal best interest. And oftentimes like courts are designed in the US and Canada and everywhere to isolate people into, it's like a plea machine. And so what I've experienced in interacting with attorneys who are representing folks who might have like goals that are otherwise, or not just like, I want this to be over as quickly as possible. That is a goal that some people have. Yeah, or sometimes struggle to understand why like someone might not want to just like simply prioritize their own individual legal best interest and be done with it. Or an attorney might understand that on like a personal ethical level. It can still be difficult for them as an attorney to like make decisions that, according to their legal training, is like not quote unquote best supporting their client. So one thing that the forthcoming lawyer's guide attempts to do is kind of like, I guess, situated a bit differently, and in that like, if courts are designed to be like this repressive apparatus, which we know them to be, then like it is the role of an attorney to help their clients like best navigate that and like best represent their interests, or help them like strategize how to get through that according to like their clients' needs, not necessarily like the lawyer's desire. And so I guess where that sometimes gets tricky for lawyers representing anarchists or radicals, especially like with J20 or these bigger cases, there's like a lot of defendants, is like then individual lawyers are like not accustomed to being accountable not just to their individual client, but to like this larger body of people who are also moving through the courts. And I think also like another thing that the book tries to do is how anarchists and other radicals may take more of an antagonistic position towards the courts than attorneys may be accustomed to encountering in their professional lives. And the other thing that the book talks about in great detail is kind of like the role of supporters, or we call them defense committees, or like solidarity crews or whatever, like all of these other people who attorneys might not be used to having some relationship with. Yeah. And we talk a bit about like the goal setting framework that we presented in the defendant's guide. So like balancing personal and political and legal goals. And we talk a bit about like various defenses that might be legal defenses that might be available to anarchists, or like that have been used effectively in court in the past little bit. And we also, as you said, like talk about when legal goals and political goals conflict, and just like considerations for navigating that. Yeah. And the guide talks about other things like common mechanisms of political repression. So like cooperative witnesses, or informants, or infiltrators, or grand juries. We talk a bit about like the sort of like neo-fascism that is on the rise in the US and Canada. And we also talk about like private security agencies and intelligence agencies, like those that have been used, for example, like at Standing Rock and other places. And I guess like the book sort of rests on this premise that political repression or just repression is kind of like this inevitable part of anarchist or radical struggle. And our position is that like it is the role of attorneys who are representing anarchists or other radical clients to like act in solidarity with them and to help them, and like the movements of which they're a part like have the best possible outcome given the shitty circumstances.
I guess we've been talking about conspiracy charges specifically and how those have been used against anarchists, both in the J20 and the Republican National Convention or RNC 8 case and others, as well as, I guess, in Canada, the Lock Street case in Hamilton and the G20 case before that. Did you want to talk a bit about why conspiracy charges are an important thing for anarchists to think about or talk about, and maybe just some of the ways that they've been used against anarchists in the US and Canada in recent years?
Yeah, in the US, I mean, there's like a handful of pretty noteworthy big conspiracy cases that have happened over like maybe the last decade or so. And in particular, I'm thinking about like Operation Backfire and Eric McDavid's case, and the RNC 8 case, and some of like animal enterprise terrorism charges, and then more recently the J20 case. Have those cases, the state has relied pretty heavily on conspiracy, and then like there's these sort of like similar-ish, certainly like strong parallels can be drawn cases in the repression that happens when looking at like the G20, for example, especially like in comparison to the RNC 8 and the J20 case, having like some parallels to what was happening with like repression against the Lock Street case. And did you want me to go into right now like kind of why I think that's a big deal?
Sure.
Well, I think conspiracy charges are something that anarchists should be thinking about, and are a big deal because legally speaking, like the crime of conspiracy is like a pretty vague one, right? In the United States, the only thing that is really like required to like prove conspiracy is like so-called like intention to agree to commit an illegal act, and then like a plan. And I'm pretty sure it's like quite similar in Canada as well. And the other thing that's interesting about like conspiracy law, I would imagine that it's similar in Canada. In the US, it's like conspiracy law or like conspiracy cases also like incorporate this thing that the courts call derivative liability, in which like alleged co-conspirators can be held like legally culpable for actions taken by other alleged co-conspirators, like whether or not they took those actions themselves or like whether or not anyone really took those actions. And so in that way, like the sort of like nebulousness of conspiracy charges makes them like kind of a favored tool of the state to target like people's ideologies and associations rather than like any explicit actions themselves. I also just like want to, in the interest of like not like exceptionalizing like anarchist like repression specifically against anarchists, I also wanted to like acknowledge or highlight the fact that like conspiracy charges are certainly not exclusively used against anarchists. They're certainly not used to like repress anarchists as a category exclusively. And in the US, like conspiracy charges are also used in like to like criminalize people of color, like especially around like the so-called war on drugs.
One thing that stands out to me is how often conspiracy charges target or criminalize routine organizing tasks like leafleting or holding a public meeting for, I think, a bunch of reasons. I mean, those are things that maybe in our context or in many different contexts people continue to do openly. So that is what the state sort of has at its disposal to go after. But what do you think anarchists should do about that, or how should we be dealing with that situation?
Oh gosh. Well, I don't know if I totally have like the solution for what anarchists should do about that necessarily, but I think
For sure.
like being aware of that as like a pattern that occurs is something and that might be useful. First of all, like I definitely agree with what you just said that kind of one of the more chilling effects of conspiracy charges are like kind of the way that their like vagueness plays out as like a criminal legal charge, is that they do criminalize activity that like typically fits well within the purview of like usually legal activity. And I know like for the organizing that was done by the Republican National Convention RNC Welcoming Committee in St. Paul in 2008, or like leading up to 2008, a lot of that activity, I mean, that group served merely as like a clearinghouse between various other groups who were planning actions, and then also like coordinated different kinds of infrastructure like housing and bikes and childcare and food and stuff that's not actually a crime, or like one might not typically assume it to be, but like the way that conspiracy charges were levied in that case made it like sort of retroactively appear to be such. Yeah, so, and like similarly with J20, and I think like with Lock Street as well, like a lot of the evidence that the state ended up using against folks was about like pretty routine open organizing tasks. Yeah, and so I think well, there's like a couple considerations around that. I think like having and continuing to have like good security practices around like higher risk actions or plans is important. And I also think it's important for anarchists to like continue to engage openly, like where it makes sense to, with the J20 case and with the RNC8 case, and likely with others in Canada and others in the US with which I'm like just less familiar. I think like some of the state's ability to create the sort of like, as I mentioned, like derivative liability in which like people who didn't, for example, like break a bank window are suddenly like culpable for the fact that someone did, came from kind of like posturing or talking or like joking commentary that happened in those like open public spaces. And so I think like having some like awareness around that and like being careful about what you say and where, without being like needlessly paranoid or like sowing unnecessary divisions, I think is something that's important to consider for the future. And I think some of that is like a little bit contextual also around like what is being talked about or what is being organized and like with whom and when and why. Like so I'm thinking about like in particular like distinctions to be made around like the conspiracy cases that I just mentioned of like Lock Street, that case being like pretty drastically different from like a summit protest in the United States, you know, where there's like all different kinds of groups coming in and like people traveling from everywhere. And like a lot of people trying to like do various kinds of actions in the same space at a similar time, whereas like Lock Street was like something happened much more spontaneously, much smaller, like as during the weekend of the Anarchist Book Fair, and like kind of like directly related to ongoing anti-gentrification struggle that had been occurring in Hamilton leading up to that, where something like a summit protest has like just a much different feel and like many like doesn't necessarily need to be accommodating to like a wider range of people, but like a wider range of people is going to be like present and engaged with that struggle no matter what. I do think, however, like I think particularly with like the Republican National Convention case for the RNC8, I think the fact that that organizing was done openly made the experience of dealing with repression afterwards like a lot easier, in that like certain forms of solidarity had been built up across different groups long before like charges were levied or like that kind of repressioning occurred. yeah, but again, there's like the context is like pretty different than the sort of like day-to-day organizing that might happen like in a small town with a smaller group of people.
Could you maybe go into a bit more detail about what some of those forms of solidarity were, or a bit more detail about that story in particular?
In the couple of years leading up to the Republican National Convention in the Twin Cities, St. Paul, Minneapolis, Minnesota, in 2008, a group of folks formed, met regularly, kind of under this group name, the RNC Welcoming Committee. And they were, as I mentioned, like kind of an informational clearinghouse between various groups who were planning actions of all kinds during the week of the Republican National Convention. And they also coordinated like various logistics and infrastructure for like protest necessities like housing or healthcare, food, transportation, medics, legal support, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah, and I think like important to note that like that group itself didn't directly advocate for nor like make plans for like any particular kind of like tactical engagement with the convention beyond like the sort of broad call to like crash, quote unquote, crash the convention, or like the ways that got interpreted was like block it from occurring in the first place. And the RNC Welcoming Committee was infiltrated by both the two members of the Ramsey County Sheriff Police Department and the FBI. And yeah, like 2 days before the convention, the Ramsey County Sheriff Department like pretty dramatically raided the houses of 3 folks who were involved with the Welcoming Committee. And those houses were places where like a lot of other people who were planning to attend the RNC were staying. So it was like very, very dramatic. And then in the days that followed, picked off, they raided 3 houses and arrested 5 people. And then in the days that followed, picked off 3 more anarchists. And these folks were held in jail for the duration of the convention. And so then those 8 people came to be known as the RNC 8. And they were actually charged under the Minnesota version of the U.S. Patriot Act. They were like the first use of that new law. And initially they were charged with felony conspiracy to riot. And then there was this enhancement added or initially to the charge. So it was like felony conspiracy to riot in furtherance of terrorism, which like, other than sounding like a very, very big deal, the other thing about that charge was that it like increased the mandatory minimum for sentencing. So it like made it such that like the potential consequences were like quite great. And then later, when they didn't just plea out, that group of people were charged with the same charges, but without the terrorist enhancement. So conspiracy to commit property damage, conspiracy to commit conspiracy to riot. Yeah. And then a decision was made. And this was like also within the backdrop of then like after the RNC was over, then there was like a slew of like, I think it was like 167 or like 200 some other people who were arrested at the protest or like at the convention protest itself, who are facing like a wide variety of like mostly lower level charges, but some people facing more serious charges for like all kinds of other stuff. And it's like one town. So then those 8 people, the RNC 8, pursued a strategy of collective defense and also mounted this like pretty targeted political campaign against what is her name? Susan Gartner, who was the county attorney in Ramsey County. So that's like an elected position. And essentially they organized like kind of like against like her desire to prosecute these charges for for quite a long time. And I think like because of the way that the organizing was done leading up to the Republican National Convention, that group of 8 people like had pretty broad support, not just amongst like anarchists and folks who were in town for the Republican National Convention, but also, and like anarchists in other places, but also like more broadly, Minneapolis has a history, like a pretty strong like leftist, socialist, progressive-y type history. And those people were like pretty strong supporters of the RNC-8 for the duration of the time that they were facing charges. And I was actually just like reflecting on it the other day, like a lot of that organizing from its very like initial onset with the like, if people haven't seen this, they should definitely watch these like welcoming committee trailer videos. And then like all of the organizing that followed had this sort of like jovial kind of like satirical tone to it that I think is just like pretty characteristic of like how folks do anarchy, like public organizing in that town. But anyway, so they had pretty broad support. And I think it was like that broad support combined with the sort of like unyielding solidarity that happened that like ultimately led to it no longer being like worth the state's time to, or like worth their money or worth their interest or whatever, to continue to push really heavy charges. And what ended up happening was that, well, what did end up happening? A couple of people fled out to lower charges or were able to like navigate a plea that they could live with. And then the charges were dropped for a larger number of people.
I'm curious about, I guess, what that looked like in terms of the J20 case. Can you talk a bit about the role of solidarity in getting through that repression?
Yeah, sure. At Donald Trump's inauguration on January 20th, a large number of people, not all of whom were anarchists, 234 people were kettled at the tail end, or what became the tail end, of an anti-fascist or anti-capitalist bloc demonstration, in which many windows were broken and a limo was set on fire, and some other stuff. And all of those people were charged with blanket conspiracy charges and property damage charges. 8 charges in total. And some people had additional like assaulting a cop charges, but everyone was facing those like blanket felony conspiracy charges. And initially, like right away, the charges were dropped for like maybe a very small handful of like journalists or other people who the state didn't have interest in pursuing charges against. And a small number of people, I think like 20, I didn't go back and check the numbers, but I think it's like 20 some people pled out initially. But then a very large number, like a significant percentage of the people who were charged, I think like 100 and some, 190 maybe, agreed to these, decided upon pursuing a strategy of collective defense, and agreed to some points of unity that essentially were that like folks weren't going to cooperate against one another, folks weren't going to work with the state. They were going to share information and resources and strategy. And then essentially like what that looked like was folks pursuing a strategy in which like everyone planned to continue to like publicly urge for the charges to be dropped while like continuing to, or being like forced to continue to move through the legal process until the charges were dropped for like every single person who's charged. And I think that like the role of solidarity in that case was like pretty incredible. When I think about like takeaways from J20, that's pretty incredible because at this like summit demonstration, you know, there's like so many people who were arrested and charged who had pretty limited experience interacting with courts or, like attending demonstrations, or like practicing certain forms of security. And for whom like it would have been within their legal and probably personal best interests to just like quickly plea out and maybe snitch on other people and just like be done with it. But then there was like another number of people for whom like the state claimed to have certain evidence against them, or they were facing like greater risk for conviction, or like would have had a harder time in potentially jail, or like dealing with probation or fines or whatever for various reasons. And the fact that not a single person like snitched on one another, or like, like cooperated with the state in various ways, to me is pretty incredible, considering also that like for the most part, defendants didn't have like pre-existing relationships with one another. In like a large kind of way, this was a summit demonstration in which like people traveled from all over the country, or like spread out pretty significantly over like the East Coast and that like half of the country in order to attend this protest. And so I think it was like both like a commitment to like certain anarchist ideals, and then also like sort of like broader like commitment to solidarity, or like being united against like a common enemy that made that all possible.
I want to ask you to maybe describe a bit what different kinds of solidarity looked like in that context.
I think there was a lot of like, certainly like later, like maybe like 6 months to a year into the anti-repression organizing, there was a lot of like emotional support or like wellness support efforts and tasks that people undertook in order to like help people feel, defendants and their supporters and their loved ones and their comrades, feel as though like we do have the collective capacity to like move through really serious repression and like face really heavy charges and come out the other side, like maybe not necessarily not traumatized, but like at least like well, I guess it's my hope, like better positioned to deal with it next time, or like with stronger or more like meaningful relationships amongst ourselves, so that like the next time that 230 people are arrested at a summit protest, we like know what to do faster, or like know what to do better, or like relate to each other better in the process. So I think like that's kind of what that looked like. That looks most inspiring when thinking about, again, like as I mentioned, like people who the state really didn't have a vested interest in continuing to pursue charges against, like people for whom the state was saying like, yeah, we have no idea, maybe they were just marching, or maybe like we kettled them at the end and we don't have any evidence of anything, continuing to engage in the court process until, well, we didn't know that the charges were going to be dropped, but until the charges were dropped against people for whom the state may have had a higher ability to convict, or like thought that they could convict. Mm-hmm.
You're listening to From Embers. If you're in the Kingston area, you can catch us on our local campus and community radio station, CFRC 101.9 FM, at 8 p.m. on Wednesdays. We're also a member of the Channel Zero Anarchist Podcast Network. We'll get right back to my interview with Jay after a quick jingle from another Channel Zero show.
It's going down, and you're invited for what they selling. We ain't buying. There is no running, there is no hiding. There's only fighting or dying. It's going down, and you're invited for what they selling. We ain't buying. There is no running, there is no hiding. There's only fighting or dying.
It's Going Down is a digital community center from anarchist, anti-fascist, autonomous, anti-capitalist, and anti-colonial movements. Our mission is to provide an autonomous and resilient platform to publicize and promote revolutionary theory and action.
Go to itsgoingdown.org for daily updates. Check out our online store for ways to donate, and rate and follow us on iTunes if you like this podcast.
I also wonder if part of an additional goal that the state had was to sort of use the legal process itself as kind of a punishment or a... Yeah.
And it worked. Yeah, totally. Yeah. I mean, that's the other thing too, kind of like, what is victory in this context, right? Like, I don't think that anyone who attended the anti-capitalist, anti-fascist demonstration on January 20th in DC on that day, I don't think that people's like sole goal was to like beat some really heavy charges, right? Like people had like broader intentions or aspirations about like what resistance to the Trump administration would look like. And then these really heavy charges, like in addition to instilling fear in a lot of anarchists and other people who were arrested on that day, like also immobilized a lot of other stuff, other resistance, other organizing that could have happened in the first year and a half, 2 years of the Trump administration. Because people were like going to court or like traveling to court, or like engaged in like this really hard anti-repression work.
I feel like to me that speaks to just, I guess, the importance of considering whether or how to engage with the legal system as a choice from the outset. Will this benefit us? Is this worth it? What is this for? What are we doing?
I maybe wanted to say something else about like the decision to engage with the courts or like how to engage with the courts. I think that's a really important point, that like within the criminal legal system, like for folks who are facing charges, like, or for anarchists who are facing sort of like heavy charges, like I don't believe there's like actually like one singular right way to deal with those things. I think it's like, as you said, a matter of considering like personal goals, sure, and like legal best options, sure, but also like what effect those decisions are going to have, like sort of in like broader political struggles that are happening like on our terrain or like outside of the courts. And for like J20 in particular, I think like the decision to pursue collective defense was in part about like a blanket commitment to like certain forms of solidarity, but it was also about like preventing the courts from like setting this broader definition of conspiracy or like preventing like sort of like prosecutorial trends from being case law, such that like that would continue to impact like the way that, or like I guess maybe like narrow the window in which like anarchists were able to engage or resist the state and Trump and all of that. But that's not like, that isn't to say that like everyone should always, like I definitely don't think that like everyone should always take their case to trial or like, I think like with Lockstreet, for example, like I thought that the way that like those folks navigated a plea, like I'm sure that the collective decision to like have the plea that occurred was like not an easy one to come to, but I think that certainly there are times in which like that is the best legal and political decision. But I think like that's somewhat contextual.
With that case in particular, the fact that the Hamilton police had charged people with unlawful assembly while masked, which was a new law that hadn't
the first use of that law, right?
I believe so, yes.
But are you saying it hadn't been used until it was used in Hamilton?
I'm not totally certain that no one had been charged with that. But I am pretty sure that it had never been tested in court.
Right.
Yet, like that, no one with that charge had gone to trial.
And that would have set a pretty dangerous precedent, right? Like we see some of that in the U.S. right now too, where like a lot of they throw on this like, and you were masked charge for like Antifa stuff. And it sets this dangerous precedent in terms of like what sorts of like legal risks are likely. And that's interesting.
I read this piece that was published on North Shore about security culture, I guess. And,
I read that as well.
Yeah. I really like appreciated a lot of the things that person had to say, and especially the stuff about not wanting to become risk averse or like wanting to consider effectiveness in terms of how we organize or what we do. So yeah, I guess in that respect, like not letting the state use fear as a weapon against us super effectively seems like an important thing to think about. Or
and easier said than done, right?
Totally. Yeah.
Yeah, let's just do that. I think that's a really good, that security culture text is really good and everyone should read it. I don't know. For myself, it's like I kind of like, I don't know, like cringe equally at both, like, I think like in the US, there's like a bit of this within like anarchist subculture, this like calls to like never be afraid or like, sort of like override like our nervous system response of fear and just like continue to do the things like kind of despite potential consequences. And I like cringe at that as equally I do the sort of like liberal individualist calls to like retreat and never take risks in the name of like quote unquote so-called self-care. So anyway, that said, I think it's like not realistic to like ask every anarchist to engage in the same like kinds of struggle or take like the same levels of risk. And I think it's important to like learn from what kinds of organizing is like readily targeted by the state and like be adaptable and resilient in response to those lessons. And yeah, on the one hand, I think it's like important to not be like ruled by fear, but I guess like the point that I'm trying to make is like, it's important to be not like ruled by fear, but it's also important to not like engage with struggle as though like repression isn't real. What was your question? Like how to transform fear?
Yeah, or what kind of like orientation towards it helps us to struggle as anarchists or do the things that we think are important.
Can you tell me what you think about it and maybe I can like build off of that?
Yeah, definitely a thing that I have found valuable is having relationships with people or like just being connected to movements against prison and having
that was the point I wanted to make too.
Like the threat of prison kind of demystified so that
no, I definitely agree with that. I think that like talking about and being like familiar with repression more broadly before it happens against like anarchists engaged in particular forms of struggle is one way to sort of like lessen the fear around taking certain kinds of risks, or like it's also another way to like situate anarchist struggle or like repression against anarchists in sort of like broader context of like carceral society. Talking about repression and like demystifying prisons before, or like kind of building culture, like making like that sort of like infrastructure part of how we engage in struggle as anarchists makes it easier to deal with when like sort of like heavy charges are levied. And I think it's also like something that separates maybe like anarchist struggle from the broader left or like progressives or like other kinds of organizing or resistance that occurs in terms of like our orientation to prison and the state.
What was some of the group decision making like for the J20 case, and how did people sort of work out a collective strategy together?
I could talk about some of the challenges of group decision making. I think that with the J20 case in particular, there were a lot of challenges around group decision making that like would not have existed if everyone was in the same place. Like just that alone, I think, made it so that we were relying on certain forms of technology to communicate with one another, and like that became a pretty significant obstacle in terms of like communicating or making decisions. I think that also like throughout day 20 there was this tension around like what kinds of decisions were made collectively or like by consensus, and like what autonomy did people have to like take various kinds of initiative without checking in with other people. And yeah, and that I don't believe that tension was ever necessarily resolved, or like that there was like space for it to be. But I think that like if I'm being really positive about it, I think it's like pretty incredible the number of decisions that are like things that like people for the most part like communicated about and agreed to, or like felt good about ultimately, or like figured out as a group, given a lot of limitations, including like geography and technology. And the fact that, again, like I mentioned this before, like with J20, like a lot of people did not know each other or have like any sort of basis or like a trusting relationship prior to being thrown into this big case together. And so like then another way that like maybe solidarity was like what got people through it was that people were able to like continue to show up for one another and like continue to communicate about like various like logistical details despite all of the challenges. Yeah. Did you want a more like concrete nitty gritty about like group calls?
I mean, I am interested in that because I feel like the actual kind of material specifics of that have effects. And
well, concretely, the way that anti-repression organizing operated was kind of like loosely around a spokes model in which and like a working group model in which there's like different working groups, for example, like a legal working group or a media working group, a wellness working group, etc., that were like open to whoever wanted to participate, supporters and defendants, and then like organized kind of like within that framework. But then there was like a lot of other like autonomous or like regional offshoots of kind of like those same general themes, like legal, media, fundraising, sort of like quote unquote wellness, probably a lot of other things I'm forgetting. And then like there were attempts to have like group calls or like coordination between all of the different things that people were doing. Sorry, what was your original question? How did group decisions get made?
What I was mostly interested in were some of those, I don't know how you would call it, like tensions or challenges or sort of the hard parts of that came up, and just different approaches that people use to resolve them. Because it's hard even in small groups.
I think that there was this tension around, like one concern I think about for the future is like decentralization, right? Because I think one thing that happened in J20 organizing was that a lot of decisions were made by the people who are physically in Washington, D.C., or even just like in closer proximity to D.C. and like its surrounding areas. And also other decisions made by like people for whom like for various reasons like had more capacity to continue to engage with the anti-repression organizing, and for a variety of reasons. And I personally like kind of reject the critique that has been levied that like any one individual or like collection of individuals like knowingly took power or like decision-making autonomy away from other people. I think more so there was like a variety of factors and limitations of just like the setup, this like giant clusterfuck of a situation in which like we were trying to account for like a very wide variety of people's very, very different needs and like and like also like different goals, while still maintaining the sort of like outward facing singular legal goal, and like outward facing political goal. Yeah. And there's maybe more to be said that I haven't thought about enough to be like quoted on about like having a lot of like internal differences about like how political goals are achieved. But like I wasn't directly involved in a lot of that conflict. So I think also like, I know like Crime Think wrote a very, very lengthy analysis about like kind of the way that some of the limitations of the anti-repression organizing that played out. So I'd refer people to that to read more about like some of those tensions. But I think that, there were, like, as I mentioned, like the tension around like centralization. There were a lot of tensions around like identity or representation. There was also tensions around like engagement with the media, both like whether to do it at all and like under what circumstances, and like if we're going to talk to the media, what do we say, or like how do we present this case in general. And like with that in particular, like this tension around like both like affirming certain tactics like property destruction or like rebellion against fascism in the state, et cetera, capitalism, and like not directly incriminating anyone. Those were some of the tensions. And there was also like tensions around people having different preferences or tendencies towards like certain degrees of formality or structure. And then all of that like situated within this context in which like people are towards the end of day 20, like I felt like I was personally like kind of my worst self, and like stressed and sleep deprived, and like also trying to like continue to engage with like the rest of my life. And those tensions make it such that like I didn't feel like people were necessarily like their best communicators or like assuming best intent of other people who were involved. What helped me get through it was remembering that like one of the things that's shitty about like repression of this like big summit protest is like people don't get to choose who their co-defendants are, like we're all kind of thrown in it together. But remembering that like we're united against this common enemy of like the state, and it behooves us, I think, to like, we don't have to all like each other. Like certainly I was never asking for everyone to like me, but like I think that we're stronger when we stick together, or we're able to like not necessarily like, I don't think that it's like always politically important to like resolve every single difference, but rather like understand where other people are coming from and like create space for like multiple things to happen at the same time or something. And I think that those like internal conflicts really got compounded like in the early spring of 2018, like around the same time that Lock Street stuff had just happened, when there was like multiple trials happening at the same time, and it just became like logistically this incredible cluster. And to be honest, I'm not like 100% sure about how things could be handled differently in the future. I think like the ways that people did show up and continue to engage are like pretty incredible given the circumstances, but certainly not without like burnt bridges and like internal like interpersonal relationships damaged as a result, which sucks. And I guess one question like I have for myself and haven't totally resolved for the future is like, what sorts of models of anti-repression organizing, like for something like the J20 protest, like what sorts of models would be effective in the future if like this like framework, like a spokes council, or like framework that relied pretty heavily on like group calls or like access and desire to engage in like certain forms of technology, like if those are not effective or like are the source of a lot of like interpersonal conflict, like then what to do instead? Or like in a case like that, might we do it differently in the future? And I don't know the answer to that at this time. I'd be curious to hear what you think about it.
It's making me think of sort of, I think this was when Cedar was interviewed on From Embers a little while ago about Pride stuff in Hamilton, which is like that separate from Lock Street stuff, in my opinion, or is kind of like related continuous repression event or something. But she said something about everyone kind of talking about how, Cedar wasn't even at Pride, and how kind of hilariously how they'd created this situation themselves, like anarchists in Hamilton had created a situation where by refusing to engage in innocence narratives for the most part, like having it be like, oh, Cedar wasn't even there. And also, it doesn't matter. We support the actions that everyone took on that day, et cetera, et cetera. Like, I just remember, I think, Cedar expressing gratitude that there had been a lot of like conversations and kind of getting on the same page with people beforehand and the people that ended up supporting them beforehand, so that when they were in jail and not able to speak publicly or make statements, kind of people said all the things that she would have wanted said. And so when I think about a summit type protest in DC, that is just not really, that is not possible. It's just not in the nature of that kind of action. And so it makes me think of like, I really don't want to discourage people from participating in stuff like that, or like traveling to go to demos or whatever the case might be. I think those are good and valuable things to do, but
kind of.
Or they can be, or, you know, if that's what you think is going to be a thing that you want to do and have an effect that you want to have in the world, then go for it. I guess I would like, maybe it would help to be able to sort of temper our expectations of what all of the range of possible things that could happen and how the aftermath is going to go. And maybe be able to sort of go in with more knowledge or have already done some kind of emotional preparing of like, yeah, like if this goes badly, I'm going to be in a long and frustrating court situation with a bunch of people I don't know who live everywhere, and just kind of know that from the outset. And
that would have been great if everyone knew that from the outset.
It doesn't necessarily solve it. Like, it's still a bad position to be in, and it doesn't really fix it, but it maybe like helps inform the conversations or that like decision making process, I guess, later, or like how.
Yeah.
I don't know.
And I'm like being somewhat pessimistic about like how interpersonal conflicts played out and how like sort of like larger political tensions played out. I will say also, like, I was not a defendant, but like my experience of J20 anti-repression organizing involved a lot of burnout, but it also involved a lot of like forming new really great relationships and friendships that I think and hope will like continue to help me and other folks stay like engaged in anarchist struggle in the future.
Do you think I guess either or both of the legal strategies that people used, as well as the like media strategies or political narratives that people created sort of divisions between different kinds of actions, or people who might have taken different kinds of actions?
Without a doubt, both of those things are true. I can't speak to all of the ways that those tensions played out. But I do think like particularly where like quote unquote innocence politics are concerned, it like gets really tricky really fast, right? Because it's like, if the goal is to not get convicted of a crime, how do you talk about how does crime get talked about publicly speaking? And I think within J20 anti-repression organizing, defendants and their supporters had a lot of different opinions and also just like experiences and political frameworks for navigating that kind of stuff. Like, there was not something that everyone could agree on. And I think like some of the earlier media that went out around J20 was about used language like around like criminalizing dissent, or did not explicitly like rely, like at no point to my knowledge, at no point did any media or like outward facing political campaign say like people didn't commit crimes that day. But I think it became tricky. There like emerged this tension, as I mentioned, between like affirming property destruction, which like the state was calling a crime in this case, and protecting people from criminal conviction.
Are there questions that you think are important, or that you have for yourself or others that you wanted to leave people with?
Yeah, I guess for myself, one thing I've been trying to think about more and more, maybe in the last couple of years, is like what sorts of practices or like intentions could or should we as like anarchist subculture like build into our day-to-day lives in order to make us like better prepared for continuing to resist the state or like show up to anarchist struggle in various ways. Yeah. I guess in terms of like navigating repression, another like broader thing that I think about, that I think I've probably talked about throughout the course of our conversation, but one thing I try to think about when I'm like talking to other people about different cases is like, what does victory mean? And how to like prevent the like concept of quote unquote victory from being like recuperated by the state, or even just like recuperated by politics that are more watered down or like diluted from like anarchist ideals or anarchist values or something. It's easier for me to just like ask a bunch of questions than it is to be like, here's the answer. I've already said this, but I think like another question I ask myself in terms of repression is like, how do we retain some like collective skills and memory around dealing with things like heavy criminal legal charges or like folks doing jail and prison time, so then we're not like trying to make it up every time it happens, you know, or like remember, like, yeah. Another thing that weighs heavily in my mind a lot of the times are like thinking about lessons learned from recent experience of political and legal repression is like how to deal with that in a way that like doesn't compromise our political integrity and allows us to like carve out, or at least not like lose political space to like continue to do the kinds of things that we want to do.
That's all for tonight. I put a bunch of links in the show notes, so check them out if you're interested in learning more about any of the cases we talked about in this interview. And as always, please get in touch. We'd love to hear from anyone out there listening. You can email us at fromembers@riseup.net. Catch you next week.